If you look in Ibn Taymiyyah's Majmu' Fatawa, he actually says calls Rashid ad-Din like a hypocrite, ignorant, things, some really nasty names.
Hello and welcome to episode 4 of the Abbasid History Podcast. The establishment of the Ilkhanate under Hulagu in 1258 marked the first time since the Arab-Muslim conquest in the 7th century that Persia fell under direct non-Muslim rule. However, with Gazan, just 30 years after Hulagu's conquest, the Ilkhanate would become a Muslim empire with a Muslim ruler blending both Mongol and Islamic traditions. Here to discuss with me his research on the process of Islamization in the Ilkhanate is Yusuf Chaudhary. Yusuf has recently graduated from SOAS in history and will be an Aziz Foundation Scholar this year at Cambridge for MPhil Classical Islamic History. Welcome, Yusuf.
Thank you, Talha.
That a conqueror would embrace the religion of his conquered subjects is a fascinating subject to investigate, and it's fortunate there is such a wealth of sources here to look at.
Yes, yeah, exactly. There's this. I don't think there's any sort of parallel in terms of other historical societies where the conqueror would actually take on the subject religion, the subject religion. I think it's one of the anomalies really of Ilkhanid rule. And about the sources as well, there's a wealth of sources. It's some scholars have called it like a golden age of historical writing. We've got sources in Arabic, Persian, Syriac, Armenian, Chinese sources, all talking about the Mongols or Ilkhanid rule. Even other empires, and the sources that we haven't even looked at enough yet from other empires. So there really is a wealth of sources there.
Would you like to mention some of these sources before we talk about this process of Islamization?
One of the main sources for Ilkhanid history is Rashid ad-Din's Jami' at-Tawarikh. He was the Ilkhanid vizier under Ghazan Khan. There's also the one Sunni Muslim scholar who accompanied Hulagu on his campaign, Ata Malik Juwaini. He has a history which starts from Genghis Khan until the conquest of Baghdad. And the secret history is another history or another work that was only recently discovered and translated, that talks about the rise of Genghis Khan and his early years, as well as some of his conquests.
In the last decade, there's been a revival in the study of the Mongols, having overcome the image of bloodthirsty, warmongering barbarians.
Part of the reason for that actually is that because of a reanalysis of the sources. So historians have gone back and re-examined the sources instead of viewing them as these uncultured nomads that came from the steppe and just destroyed everything. That image that the Mongols or the Ilkhanid itself didn't really achieve anything has been re-examined. I think it started in the 70s with Bernard Lewis, who said that the level of destruction that the Mongols caused was probably may well have been exaggerated, and that they weren't necessarily the reason for this decline of what people call an Islamic golden age. And then when we re-examine the sources and you look at actually Persian sources from within the Ilkhanate, those that I just mentioned, Rashid ad-Din, Juwaini, others, Mustafi, Wasaf, they paint a different picture of Ilkhanid rule, one that's of this flourishing of intellectual and cultural exchange. My lecturer at SOAS, Dr. George Lane, he actually called the Ilkhanate period a Persian Renaissance.
Wow. And so why do you use the term Islamization rather than conversion when you look at how these Mongol rulers become Muslim?
I think in some sense Islamization can be more accurate than simply conversion, because it contains within it this sense of adopting elements of like a shared Islamic culture, or repackaging the original culture in an Islamic type of framework, instead of just a mere conversion, where you usually talk about conversion as something that happens to individuals, whereas Islamization is something that happens to societies. So yeah, it's the usage there was it's not just about individual conversions, but about Ilkhanate society as a whole, how it became Islamic in that sense. Andrew Peacock has analyzes the use of the term Islamization in his book on comparative perspectives on Islamization.
Okay, so let's jump straight in. Who's the first Ilkhanate ruler to adopt Islam?
The first one we've got is Ilkhan Tegedas, who took the name Ahmed. He was Hulagu's son and the third Ilkhanate ruler. There's some later sources actually say that Hulagu adopted Islam months before he died, but those are like post Ilkhanate fabrications. So the first one was Tegedas Ahmed.
And tell us this process of his becoming Muslim, because there seems to be some dispute whether he actually became Muslim or not, and how he became Muslim.
One Ilkhanate scholar, Reuven Amitai, he actually analyzes the conversion narrative of Tegedas. So there are a couple of accounts. One of them, which is this quite unlikely one, is that when he was young, he saw with Hulagu a group of sheikhs from the Rifa'i order, like walking into fire and then coming out unharmed, a miracle on their part, and that kind of influenced him to become Muslim, and he became Muslim while he was still young. But then there's issues with the chronology of that report, because according to Rashid ad-Din, which because of his association with the Mongol court is more reliable, that Tegedas was only just born when Hulagu left for his campaign in Iran. So we're not exactly sure when Tegedas converted, but we do know that it was at least before he became the ruler. They said some of the sources say that when he became ruler, his name was Ahmed. In a few other sources, there's a mention of this like pseudo Sufi sheikh called Kamal ad-Din Abdur Rahman, who was more like a trickster who gained popularity in Mongol court by like tricks that he passed off as miracles, and that he was the one who eventually converted Tegedas. But with both, when you consider all of the accounts together, there's this sense that he was influenced when he was young or growing up by Sufis, and that led him to convert. But we're not exactly sure of the details behind that.
And then we see the successive rulers actually do not adopt Islam until the sixth one, Baidu, although his conversion as well is also disputed.
Yeah, Baidu's conversion doesn't get any attention at all in the sources. It's overlooked in a majority of them, and part of the reason for that's probably because of the civil war between Baidu and Gazan. So a lot of Rashid ad-Din, he was pro Gazan, so he's obviously going to pass off or just completely ignore Baidu's conversion in that short period where he had a claim to being the Ilkhan. Bar Hebraeus, a Christian theologian who converted from Judaism, he says that Baidu was only Muslim in name, that he never actually learnt how to like pray or fast or anything like that. But because Bar Hebraeus is actually saying that Baidu still remained a Christian, so that might be an exaggeration on Bar Hebraeus' part. but because we don't have any information on Baidu's conversion, we can't say.
So the sources often focus on a ruler's conversion, but it appears Mongol society as a whole was adopting Islam.
I think for the sources, you might agree that that's the nature of like historical writing in general of the period of the time, that most historical writing focused particularly on the rulers rather than the subjects. But the pattern of conversion that we see in Mongol societies, not just the Ilkhanate but the Golden Horde as well, is that it was this bottom-up process that began with the lower levels of society, among the soldiers, local generals and governors, and then it worked its way up. By the time Gazan had converted in 1296, it worked its way up, so that like a large population of Mongol soldiers and elite had become Muslim. So part of the reason why Gazan might have converted would be to get them on his side in the war against Gazan. In the war against Baidu. We've got some sources as well that mention like Mongol converts, Muslim converts, like going to India or being refugees in fleeing to the Mamluk lands between like 1260 and 1290 before Gazan ascends to the throne.
And Judith Pfeiffer has an ingenious way of tracking conversions of other strata of Mongol society. Tell us about that.
Pfeiffer's analysis actually comes from Richard Bulliott's analysis of using names and name changes to look at the rate, the pace of conversion, the time of conversion, and whether when certain families or certain people adopted Muslim or Arabic names. Based on that, we can see the pace and the time of conversion and frame that against the historical context, the wider historical context. So Pfeiffer does the same with the Ilkhanate, looking at a number of Mongol emirs. She takes from this book, a book by Rashid ad-Din, and so she looks at the absolute number of emirs or names of emirs mentioned in the work, and then identifies all of the Persian or Persian-Muslim names, and then comes out with like a figure. So for Hulagu, if I remember correctly, it was like 6 to 7% of the emirs were Muslim. But then around 30 years later, when you get to the reign of Gai Khatu, it was 30% of the emirs had Persian-Muslim names.
We see that Sufi orders are prominent in the Islamization of Mongol society, and it's argued that there was an overlap between the forms of Sufism the Mongols encountered and their indigenous shamanism. But you don't believe this is the case, do you? Tell us why.
The similarity between Sufis and shamans shamanism was suggested originally by some Turkish historians, that there were these really unorthodox antinomian Sufis that were supposedly similar to the Mongol steppe shamans, and that's one of the reasons why Sufis had such a great prominence in Ilkhanid realm, or among Mongols in general, with the Golden Horde as well and the Chagadayids. But if you go and look at some of the first interactions that the Mongols or Hulagu had with that type of Sufis, he executed a group of them because he was told they're just like they're superfluous elements of the world, as in they're not really they're not important at all. But that idea, that suggestion of a similarity, came out of thinking that the concept or the spiritual experience or the miracles of Sufis was similar to the experience of shamans and the work that shamans could do. But then the underlying concepts behind Sufism, I'm not going to talk about shamanism that much because I'm not an expert on it, but the underlying concepts of shamanism, such as of Sufism, such as like this annihilation in the divine essence or gnosis of God, is some scholars have pointed out as completely completely alien to shamanism.
You've alluded to some of the motivations for why some of these rulers would have accepted Islam, but overall, you seem to identify three main reasons for the motivations of conversion.
Yeah, so one of the issues is that the sources don't really discuss why the general people convert or why rulers convert. So we kind of have to speculate there. Ideally, the sources would just say it's because they realize the truth of the religion. So that's everyone worked out that the religion was true. That's why they converted. But more in terms of looking at the situation, we can see there's like this close intermingling of Mongols and Muslims, especially Hulagu's conquest. He levied troops from Iran, from the local Muslim states as well, so that the soldiers were all mingling together. You had governors ruling over Muslim subjects, so that like close relationship between the Mongols and the Muslims was one of the reasons. Trade as well. Whenever a ruler converted to Islam, we see in the Golden Horde and the Chagadai Ilkhanate that when Burke converted to Islam, traders came from to give him gifts. The same thing in the Chagadai Ilkhanate as well. Traders after the ruler converted, traders came to shower him with gifts and establish trade routes. So the same thing happened could well have happened with the Ilkhanate.
But you also mentioned this idea, the love of knowledge, kind of within Mongol society, was also a reason for them to be attracted to kind of Islamicate Persian culture.
Yeah, so because they're coming from the steppe background, a nomadic like culture, and when they come into Iran, they see like they've got like an environment of like history of great empires and great intellectual achievement, and for some of the more the elites of Mongol society, such some of the governors as well, they were quite drawn to that as well. The rulers themselves were drawn to the intellectual work of a lot of Muslim scholars. You have Hulagu was actually commanded after he conquered Alamut to send Nasiruddin at-Tusi back to Monkey in China.
Nasiruddin Tusi being the astronomer and philosopher.
Yeah, the famous astronomer and philosopher. But Monkey had died, so Hulagu decided to keep Nasiruddin with him. There are other scholars as well that had a very close relationship with Mongol rulers, and it could have been that fascination with the sciences and like practical knowledge. One of the sources mentions that the Mongols had love for practical knowledge, things like astronomy, medicine, finance, and things like that. And that could have been one of the reasons why they were fascinated with Islam and the culture of the administration and the culture, the Persian culture.
Let's turn to the Ilkhanate's relationship to his conquered Muslim subjects. You challenge the popular notion that the Mongols were hostile to the conquered Muslim subjects, even under Hulagu.
Yeah, that notion's, I think that notion now in terms of the current state of historiography is quite outdated now. But it's, even though in academia we've kind of understood that the Mongols weren't like this anti-Muslim or anti-Islamic empire, or didn't form an anti-Islamic empire, in popular conception it still exists. I remember reading in one popular book on Islamic history that Hulagu was influenced against Islam by Christian and Buddhist advisors. And that's just that's a gross misrepresentation, because one, as I just mentioned, large parts of Hulagu's army was composed of Muslims from local states as well. As well as that, he was surrounded by devout Muslims. You have Atta Malik Jawaini, who actually said that Hulagu's conquest of Alamut and the defeat of the Ismaili assassins was part of God's secret intent in bringing Islam to the world. And then you've got like Nasiruddin al-Tusi, Qutbuddin al-Shirazi. They were all close or related in some way to Hulagu. Then you've like common like things that we have in our minds, like the caliph being wrapped up in a carpet and then trampled over. From some people's perspective, it's not a nice way to go out.
You're referring here to the execution of Mu'tasim, the last Abbasid caliphate.
Yeah, and the reason, from the Mongol perspective, though, the reason for that is that was considered an honourable death because his blood never touched the ground, and they were afraid that because he was a ruler, and he was God's caliph, that if they spilt his blood on the ground, they would be punished by God. It's interesting as well when Hulagu after the conquest of Baghdad, or the siege of Baghdad, Hulagu actually gathered a group of both Shia and Sunni scholars and asked them for a fatwa on rulership. So he said, what's more preferable, a just ruler, a just non-Muslim or just disbeliever, or unjust believing ruler? And all of the scholars actually, they were all afraid of saying anything until one of them, Ibn Tawus, he said that a just disbeliever is better than an unjust believing ruler. But then if you go back and look at other like that, Ibn Tawus, he was a Shia scholar, but if you look at some Sunni literature, Fakhruddin al-Razi, in the period just before the Ilkhanate, in the late 12th and early 13th century, he actually says that political rule remains with disbelief but doesn't remain with injustice. And that's repeated by another scholar who's living under the Ilkhanate, al-Baydawi.
Al-Baydawi, author of the famous tafsir, famous
Yeah.
exegesis of the Quran.
Yeah, the famous tafsir, which he supposedly dedicated to Arghun Khan.
So we do find lots of Muslim administrators under the Ilkhanate. There appears to be some ambivalence by the famous poet Rumi about Muslims working for the Mongols. Tell us more about this.
That comes from Maulana Rumi's discourses, Fihi Ma Fihi, where I think that really shows like the real Rumi, where he's like advising his disciples, and in some cases he's quite harsh against them. So it's not like this lovey-dovey version that's quite popular. He's one of his disciples was the Parvana, or the governor of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, Mu'in ad-Din. Initially, Rumi really rebukes him and blames him. He's saying, like, your alliance, or the Seljuk alliance with the Mongols, is a reason for the diminishment of Islam, and it's not good. But elsewhere, he says that the Parvana complains to Maulana Rumi that he can't devote himself to Rumi as he thinks he should, because he's preoccupied with Mongol affairs. Now, in that situation, Rumi actually consoles him and said, "It's okay. You're working for the service of Islam, and this preoccupation you've got with dealing with the Mongols is okay." But in around the 1270s or 1277, the Parvan was actually executed on the suspicion that he was trying to get the Mamluks to invade Anatolia. So that could have been the Mongol affairs that Rumi was saying, reassuring him about.
Even Arghun, Arghun's reputation for being anti-Muslim is unjustified in your view as well. Tell us why.
So Arghun was the fourth Ilkhan. He had a really bad reputation from that was found in mostly Western historians' works from the 19th and 20th century that portrayed him as hostile to Islam. One of the reasons for this is they were using this 15th century work. It's anonymous work called Shajara al-Atrak. Claims that Arghun deposed Tegeda because the Mongol emirs and the elite were offended at Tegeda's conversion to Islam. But Rashid ad-Din al-Hamadani, the vizier under Gazan, says that it was actually because Tegeda was secluding himself with his teacher and his Sufi sheikhs and not taking care of matters of the state. And he also was trying to make peace with the Mamluks, which apparently he didn't consult with or didn't have the support of the rest of the elite. And you've got other sources like Wasaf, was much later, towards the end of the Ilkhan. It actually claims that, or they use things like Arghun's appointment of a Jewish vizier, Sa'ad ad-Dawla, as a reason to prove that he was anti-Muslim. So Wasaf says Sa'ad ad-Dawla had this hit list of 200 Muslims that he wanted to execute, and that he had this plan where he wanted to send a fleet of ships through the Red Sea and attack Mecca and destroy the Kaaba, turn it into an idol temple with Arghun as the head of a new religion. It's quite fanciful stuff. So those historians that were writing on the Mongols, like E.G. Brown, they used these sources or these references to portray Arghun or to show that he was anti-Muslim. But then when you go back and you examine them again, you find, well, Wasaf doesn't have any evidence, or there's no evidence for this hit list in earlier sources. And the plan to go through the Red Sea and attack Mecca was more likely a plan that was developed to attack the Mamluks by using Genoese soldiers to go through the Red Sea and attack the Mamluks from behind. And so by the time that story reaches, or that plan was never realized. So by that time that story reaches Wasaf, it's embellished with this anti-Jewish sentiment against Sa'ad ad-Dawla. As for Arghun himself, we've actually got a lot of sources that paint completely the different picture. That he had a really close relationship with Muslims. He had a close relationship with the Sufi master Ala ad-Dawla Samanani, who was quite a well-known Sufi figure, quite high up in the Mongol court, and he was a confidant for Arghun. And then as well, we mentioned Baydawi. He wrote this. His tafsir apparently was dedicated to Arghun, and he wrote this pocket history called Nizam at-Tawarikh, where he actually praised Arghun. He says that Arghun, he was an amazing ruler. He was strong, he was powerful, he was just, and everyone liked him. And that was actually used as propaganda for the Ilkhanate.
So you feel there's already an atmosphere within Mongol society increasingly inclined to Islam. Would you see Gazan's conversion as almost inevitable?
I would say yes. I think with everything considered up to the point, it was just a case of which ruler would be the one to finally have that all-important conversion. So that because of the trend of the slow Islamization or the conversion of the soldiers or the lower levels of society, the elites and the governors, and then by the time it gets by the time you get to Gazan, they said that a large population of Mongol society had already converted. So it does make his conversion inevitable in that sense. And those that didn't convert or that hadn't converted up until that point all converted when Ghazan did as well.
And yet there seems to be many contradictions in his life. There's a quite remarkable fatwa that he seeks. Tell us about that.
That fatwa is he wanted, so even though he had converted to Islam, he still wanted to remain true to the Mongol traditions and the yasa. And this the issue of the yasa and its relationship with the Sharia is one of the points of contention.
The yasa being traditional Mongol law.
The yasa, traditional Mongol law, that's one of the points of contention that some Muslim scholars had with the Ilkhanate conversion,
particularly Ibn Taymiyyah.
Yes, yeah. So Ibn Taymiyyah's argument was that the Mongols weren't true Muslims because they had not wholly adopted the Sharia, but they still retained their traditional Mongol law, the Yasa developed by Genghis Khan. But going back to the Gazan's fatwa, he wanted to marry one of his father's wives, not his mother, but one of his father's wives, which is forbidden in Islamic law. So he tried to find a way to do this while remaining within the bounds of Islam, without having to say, look, I'm just going to ignore that this is a rule in Islam and go ahead and do it anyway. So he sought a fatwa, and this unnamed scholar apparently said, yeah, go ahead, it's fine. And that scholar justified his decision by saying that it was better than Ghazan leaving Islam to do it than so he justified it based on saying that, look, he did that, but he's still a Muslim, so it's okay.
I think what I personally find fascinating about this process of Islamization within the Ilkhanate is an observation. It coincides an observation that Adam Silverstein makes in his very short introduction to Islamic history, which is that the times where most people became Muslim did not necessarily coincide with heights of Muslim political power. Would you have any thoughts on that?
I said that's a really interesting observation as well. That in the case of the Ilkhanate, that's certainly true. There could be other reason, or that doesn't. I don't think that really examines what the reasons for that were. I haven't seen the context in which Adam Silverstein says it, so I can't really discuss that. But in the case with the Ilkhanate, that's certainly true.
And the other issue which I find particularly interesting about your studies, and something that your studies kind of led me to, was the Denise Agle's article on Ibn Taymiyyah's polemical fatwas against Ghazan.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us more about Ibn Taymiyyah in particular, because he's such a pivotal figure for later generations of Muslims in trying to make sense of perceived failings in kind of Muslim governance. How do you make sense of this conflict between Ibn Taymiyyah and the Muslim rulers the Muslim scholars who backed Ghazan?
So there was, for Ibn Taymiyyah, I think he really saw the Mongols. Well, one, there's the whole propaganda element, because he was a Mamluk scholar. It was the Mamluk, the rulers, who had asked him for fatwas because he was incredibly popular. So his one of his arguments was that the problem actually was that the Muslim soldiers in the Mamluk realm were concerned about fighting now fellow Muslim soldiers from the Mongol realm, and so some of them had refused to fight because they're saying, look, we're both Muslims now. What's the point? Why should we continue fighting? So Ibn Taymiyyah said that, hold on a minute, let's look at the nature of their conversion. So he said that they're not, although they had converted to Islam, they hadn't completely become Muslim in his conception, because they hadn't they still retained their Mongol traditions and certain beliefs and practices that they carried with them from the steppe, and their belief in like putting Genghis Khan as like this prophet-like figure as well, the retaining the Yasa, the Mongol law. So he said, because they haven't completely become Muslim yet, we can the fight still goes on. Whereas in the Mongol realm, in the Ilkhanate, you had you've got Rashid ad-Din al-Hamadani. So again, he was the vizier for Gazan, and he actually wrote theological works as well. He was Ibn Taymiyyah's main opponent. So Ibn Taymiyyah would, if you look in Ibn Taymiyyah's Majmu' Fatawa, he actually like says like calls Rashid ad-Din like a hypocrite, ignorant, things, some really like nasty names, and because he said that Rashid ad-Din al-Hamadani is like selling out Islam. Rashid ad-Din's position is a bit more difficult to work out, because we don't have his theological works. They're still in manuscript form. We've got I think the Arabic translation, if I'm remembering correctly, is still in manuscript. The Persian original is lost. But his argument was that even though they retained the Yasa, there were lots of parts of the Yasa that were still compatible with the Sharia. So it's quite an interesting situation with Rashid ad-Din's justification of the Ilkhanate. We can see some parallels between like the discourse of like secular law and Islamic law, and some of the arguments that go on in certain Muslim circles.
And before we end, tell us about your course on the life and works of the seminal Sunni theologian Abul Hasan al-Ash'ari.
My course on Abul Hasan al-Ash'ari, or the history of the Ash'ari school, I think theology is like one of my favorite topics or subjects to study as a pastime. So or not really as a pastime, because I actually use it as well I teach theology. But what I wanted to do in that course, I wanted to look at focus on like the historical development of the Ash'ari school, the largest school of Islamic theology, because I found that even in terms of literature and like classes or courses, there's not really much that looks at the history of traditional Islamic theology. Lots of books focus on like the development of Islamic philosophy, Ibn Sina, al-Farabi, and you get to some of al-Ghazali, al-Razi, and things like that, but nothing that focuses more on the traditional theologians. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to bring that into and to expose some like university students or just people in general to that side of Islamic intellectual history.
Yusuf, thank you for being our guest.
Thank you very much.